Welcome back to another Fantasy Puck video, guys. It's Chris, and today I'm going to be giving you 6 tips to win your leagues after you draft. These are things that you could be doing yourself, whether it's directly after your draft or leading into the regular season, but setting yourself up for success right after you draft is something that's very important. Every single person is guilty of number 5. Do not lie to me. You've done it before, but these are 6 tips that are going to help you win your guys' leagues. Now, some of these might be very obvious to you, but for others, it could be something that is relatively new. So keep that in mind. I'm going to try and get as detailed and in-depth as possible. Tip number 1 is to stash and watch list players. This is something that I like to do directly after a draft, whether I have players that I've drafted that are injured or are currently out that I'm able to put on, IR plus if that's available to you, or just IR in general if that's available to you. And I also really like to watch list players that I like that I couldn't get to in the draft that have high upside or that are sleepers that we like, and just something that I'm able to tab to when I'm researching or doing a little bit of review for players early on in the season, where I'm able to just see a list of all the players that I like. Use IR spots if available. Like, say for example, you want to pick up Max Pacioretty, you can throw him directly onto IR because he's still listed as LTIR, and then you're able to pick up another player. Again, a pretty obvious tip that most of you should be doing on a regular basis. But one thing that I do see a lot of you doing that you put yourself and kind of handcuff yourself is that you use IR spots for players that you're going to roster every single week anyways. A really good example of this that I've seen early on that managers have been doing is they put Andrei Svechnikov on IR immediately, and then they pick up players, and you're just going to have to end up dropping those players for when Svech plays the first game and he comes off of LTIR. Don't handcuff yourself by wasting that IR spot on a player that is going to play game 1. Tip number 2, this is something that you can be doing throughout the entire regular season, and I recommend that you do. This is a very, very critical tip. This honestly allows you to win leagues, guys. Perfect example was Erik Karlsson last year. Absolutely popped off at the start of the season. If you snagged him early enough, you kept him on your team for the whole year, and he was a league winner, had over 100 points as a defenseman. This could go for pretty much any goalie tandem, any goalies in the National Hockey League as well. If one major one gets injured, like Vasilevsky, for example, you go and you pick up the guy that is going to then become the starter. We have you covered with streamers, so don't worry about that. If you're watching this channel, if this is your first time on the channel, welcome. Every single week, we are going to have a daily list of streamers, must adds, must drops. So again, if you want to have that information available to you sooner than everybody else to beat other teams in your league to picking up these crucial streamers, be sure to check out our Patreon, guys. The other thing that you can be doing is just taking a little bit of time during your day, getting yourself into a routine and allocating some time to checking line rushes. You can find this information on Left Wing Lock, Daily Faceoff, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. But I recommend establishing a routine to where you're checking lines, player ice time, stuff like that, that allows you to learn more about what's happening in terms of player deployment and what's happening with players on your team. So learning this information early on is going to be crucial for player valuation and future trades. I personally recommend finding yourself a routine, whether it's 5 minutes in the morning when you're having your coffee and your breakfast, or even like just during your lunch or anything like that. The sooner you find out critical information like this, the more likely it is you're going to be able to capitalize on it. My third tip for you guys is find sources and projections that you're able to use in season that will allow you to better evaluate players or find players that you might not have considered to be good options. I recommend 2 to 3 creators, websites, articles, whatever it is that you like to absorb in terms of content, but at least have 2 to 3 sources that you trust. The reason why I recommend having multiple sources is because you get different opinions on players. If you haven't already, go check out our Creators League draft. I'll have a link in the description for basically everybody that was involved in that. Go check these guys out. These guys are very knowledgeable, very good fantasy hockey players and content creators. And the reason why I say make sure it's in-season content is because things drastically change when it comes to allocations of ice time. Similar to what we were talking about in tips 1 and 2, You just don't know who's available on your waiver wire that could honestly make a giant impact on your team. And in-season projections are going to be able to cut out things like opinions and bias and just give you straight numbers on what players are jumping and falling in terms of their value. So definitely find some in-season projections. We're going to have a ton of in-season projections and updates for you guys this season. So again, if you're interested in that, be sure to check out our Patreon tiers as well too. We have lots of good content for you guys in season as well. Tip number 4 is something that you can probably evaluate right after your draft or into the first couple weeks of the regular season, but you should be able to tell immediately what your team's strengths and weaknesses are and what your opponent's strengths and weaknesses are. What positions do you have depth in? Do you have 2 elite goaltenders and are missing some, high-end forwards? What is your team missing in terms of stats? Always consider your league settings as your primary form of evaluating players. If I don't count hits in my leagues, that means that Brady Tkachuk is not as valuable as a guy like Kirill Kaprizov. But you should be able to tell really early on or immediately just based off of looking at your players, do I have a lot of depth in defense? Do I have a lot of depth in goaltending? Which do I think is more valuable? Maybe I can trade one of my elite forwards for an elite defenseman and kind of help that position. Tip number 5, do not panic on players. Everybody say it with me. This is the thing that I see the most. This is the thing that I've already seen with managers in Discord, managers that are asking me about teams. Everybody seems to be trading players right out of the gate. If you like specific guys that you weren't able to get to in the draft, or you're trading for more like high-end players, for example, I think that's totally fine. But don't ever panic on players. Let's go over this trade that happened. This was a $100 keeper league that I was in. This trade happened last year. I was able to snatch Kyle Connor and Thatcher Demko from a guy that was drastically panicking on his players early on. Kyle Connor was struggling to score. He wasn't getting a lot of points. All he was doing was, shooting the puck and basically nothing else. Thatcher Demko was getting absolutely lit up in Vancouver to start the season. And I was able to leverage Carter Hart as having a good kind of start to the season in Philadelphia. And I honestly don't remember why he wanted Alexis Lafreniere. I think it had something to do with him playing top 6 minutes and the combination of hits and shots that he was getting early on in the season. At the time, the stats were very, very comparable between all of these players. And you look at this on paper and you're like, oh, you're playing in a Mickey Mouse league. Nobody should ever make this trade ever. It doesn't matter what you guys think of the trade. The fact was that this manager was drastically panicking on his players' performance early on in the season. And again, this was something that I was able to leverage to just outright fleece him in terms of getting value back. That's something to always consider when making trades. Is this player just struggling right now, or is this player actually not good at hockey? Do not panic on players. This is the most important tip. Make sure that you don't end up like this guy and trading away high value players just because they're struggling early on in the season. One thing to highlight is look at the date, guys. October 23rd, not even a month into the season yet. So be sure that you're not panicking on players, especially early on in the season. And finally, our last tip is identify buy low, sell high candidates. Notice how I said identify and not trade for. Important to understand, you still need sample size when it comes to this step. A really good example of this is, say, Connor Brown absolutely pops off with Connor McDavid on his line. Does that mean I'm going to trade Austin Matthews if he hasn't scored in 4 games for Connor Brown? No, absolutely not. But I'm able to identify Connor Brown at that point as a sell high player. Again, sample size matters, and sample size is something that you're able to leverage, like you saw in the previous tip, tip 5, don't panic on players, to your advantage. And again, you need sample size for this to be effective. I don't want to trade away a player after 10 games. It doesn't matter who it is. If it's Austin Matthews, if it's Connor Brown, if it's Nick Delorier, it doesn't matter who the player is at that point, but I need more than just a week's worth of sample to evaluate a player. And finally, guys, utilize your resources. We're going to have a ton of content for you guys in terms of buy low, sell high players, players you need to add right away, players you need to drop right away. We're on top of this, and we're here to help you guys win your league. So utilize your resources. Like I said early on, have 2 to 3 that are kind of, different sources that you're able to pull from and make your own opinion on, and then utilize that to win your guys' leagues. That is going to do it for this video, guys. thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you guys are able to gain some value out of this. Some of these tips might be very obvious to you guys, but for other players and new fantasy managers, these are very, very important. Again, leave a comment down below on something that you think could drastically help managers going forward when it comes to winning their leagues. But be sure to leave a like and hit that subscribe button if you guys enjoyed our content, guys. It really, really helps us out. We have a ton of content coming for you guys in season especially, so be sure to stay tuned for that as well. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have yourselves a fantastic rest of the day.